and it's a privilege to be here this morning. My history with the School Boards Association goes back to 1994. 2 years after I left government at the beginning of 1993. And in 1994, and I'm going to give some of this history here, I was working for an organization that was primarily led by the Missouri School Boards Association that was in opposition to Hancock 2. And we ultimately defeated Hancock 2. And since that time, I've been very close with the School Boards Association. And, many friends there, Carter Ward, Melissa, Mike. And so it's really a privilege to be here today. And due to that, whenever the initial thing in 1994 was I put out a report that was, I did the writing and then they made it look nice. And when I got the first draft back, the cover said, the Moody report. And I looked at that and I said, man, that's pretty self-serving. I think we ought to take that off. And they said, nah, we're paying you and we want to brand this so that people know this. And so some of the data that I'm going to show you today is an accumulation of reports that I've done since 1994. And actually, some of it's hard to find anymore if you try and look back and say, okay, what happened when? So what we're going to do today, we're going to look at June 2016 revenues, which were just terrible. We're going to try and put those revenues in a historical revenue overview. We're going to talk about the factors that impact state revenues and what the historical trends mean for future state revenues. And then Senate Bill 509, which was passed in 2014, calls for tax cuts in the future, and we're going to show you how that's going to work. So June 2016 was just terrible. And at the end of May of 2016, GR growth for the year through 11 months was 3.4%. At the end of June, it was 0.9. So think about that. The year-to-date general revenue dropped about 2.5% in 1 month. And part of that was refunds. Refunds are a reduction in revenue. And Governor Nixon, due to criticism of people saying they weren't getting their refunds, told the Department of Revenue to push the refunds out quickly. And so that's part of the issue, is that individual income tax refunds in June 2016 were $211 million, and compared to about $97 million the year before, or 116% increase. And then the corporate refunds, and I'm going to get into this in detail later, but corporate income refunds were up almost 53%. And one of the impacts of this, if you would have figured out Senate Bill 509 at the end of May, an income tax cut would have been triggered. If you look at the end of June, an income tax cut was not triggered, and part of that may have been refunds. As I look at it more closely, my attitude is probably not, that even with pushing the refunds out, that probably wasn't the causal effect of not triggering 509, but it is what it is. So graphically showing you, again, a 22.8% drop in revenues in June, 23% in individual income tax, 46% in corporate income tax, and pretty much everything was negative in June. I am going to get into this, again, great detail here in a little while, but have you read one newspaper article that says, did you know that corporate receipts dropped 36% last year? Our third largest source of revenue dropped 36%. There is not one article that I've seen, and virtually no policymakers are talking about this, but when you think about this, your property tax levies for a school district. If you were to drop 36% in a year, you would be going crazy saying, what in the world happened? And yet this is one of the best kept secrets in Jefferson City. the drop was about $155 million. So if you just take away the drop in corporate income tax receipts, that's more than the $150 million, which is the trigger for Senate Bill 509. Huge problems. And again, no policymakers are really talking about this, and I'm going to show you exactly what I think happened here in a little while. So our general fund, about 70% of it comes from the individual income tax, about 23% from the sales tax, and within the individual income tax, about 65 to 70% of the money comes from withholdings. So when you pay a teacher, for example, the money is withheld for their taxes, and then those are remitted weekly or monthly, depending upon the taxpayer. And then the other source, a major source of individual income tax is capital gains. And capital gains, it's really hard to figure out what's happening because the 2014 federal data on capital gains from Missouri just got posted to the University of Missouri's website in August of 2016, okay? So I'm speculating on what happened in 15 because the federal tax data is not yet available. But capital gains primarily comes from people who do remittances and declarations. And what is that? Okay, my business, I'm an LLC, and I file my taxes quarterly, not monthly. And so when I'm paying my taxes and then settling up at the end of April, there's always a settle up period, you're a remitter or a declarer. And so this is the history of remittances and declarations. And as you can see in 2015, and the importance of this is I believe this is primarily where capital gains are reflected. Whenever people in April make their final payments and they write a big check. And as you can see in 2015, remittances and declarations increased by $211 million, whereas in fiscal 16, they declined from that by $61 million, which is a little puzzling because, to be honest with you, at the end of when the revenue estimate for 16 was 2.8%, I thought we were going to exceed that, and I was wrong. But the reason I thought we would exceed that is because of capital gains. And why would I think that? Well, this is the history of capital gains in about the last 20 years. And if you look over here, you can see the peak in 2007. That's $9 billion subject to Missouri income tax in Missouri, $9 billion of capital gains. And as you can see, after the recession in 2008, 2009, it dropped to slightly more than $2 billion. But look at what happened after the last recession, the recession of 2001. Look at the huge drop in capital gains, but then it went back up to $9 billion. And it was my assumption that that trend was going to occur and that these lines would continue to go up. From the remittance and declaration data, it looks to me like that did not happen. So, I've told some other groups I've talked to, you really know you're a nerd when you can reach onto the bookshelf in your office and pull out the fiscal year 91 budget, okay? Which is what I did recently to prepare this slide. If you look at our revenue base, in 1991, when I was responsible for the state budget, it was 48% individual income tax, 32% sales tax, and about 8.5% corporate. Fast forward to 2016, individual income tax is almost 70% of the general revenue budget, sales tax is 23%, and corporate income has dropped to 3.2%, and I believe will continue to drop. And so if you want to know how schools are going to do, how's the budget going to look, just look at individual income tax and sales tax. So at 70%, that has to grow or there's not going to be any growth. And the problem we have, again, with individual income tax, it's driven by two or three things. One is employment growth, and by most national measures, we're considered at pretty much full employment right now. The other is inflation in wages. Well, you heard what Daryl was talking about here. We're in a 1% inflationary environment, 1 or 2%, and I just don't see those happening. And it was my assumption that capital gains would continue to grow, but certainly from the remittance and declaration data recently, it doesn't look like that's happening. And so if 70% of your budget is not growing, that is a big problem. And oh, by the way, when we get to Senate Bill 509, we have authorized 5 tax cuts which have not yet occurred in our largest revenue source. So when we grow, we're going to cut taxes and reduce our largest revenue source. Many of you have seen this presentation maybe in the last 3 weeks. I've talked to a number of school administrators, and it's my belief that withholdings are impending, that they're going to happen here pretty quickly. And why would I say that? Well, remember I told you the huge drop-off in June? So compared to the revenue estimate of 2.8%, we grew by 0.9, which leaves your base short 1.9%. The revenue estimate for the current fiscal year then is 4.1% growth. Add 4.1 plus 1.9, that's 6 that you need to grow to keep from withholdings. And then on top of that, recently there's been a tendency to not set aside money for the supplemental budget. Last year, the supplemental budget, primarily for Medicaid, was $300 million. At a presentation to the House Budget Committee the day before veto session, the budget director said they hope to keep the supplemental below $100 million, but at $100 million, you need to grow another percent just to fund the supplemental. So 6 plus 1 is 7. And I don't see any chance of the general fund growing by 7. So if withholdings were to occur, let's assume 3% growth. And at 3% growth, a very, very reliable member of Governor Nixon's cabinet has told me if we grow 3%, we will not have enough money to pay our bills at the end of June next year. Okay? But at 3% growth, you need to withhold at least $275 million. That's just accounting for 6% of the revenue estimate. And so I think you're looking at within 2, 3, 4 months here, withholdings in the $250 to $300 million range at least. So this drives me crazy. I'm going to talk about tax cuts here, and I got to tell you, I have testified against all of these bills. And on Senate Bill 509, this appeared in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch on July 2nd, and it says, Missouri's first tax cut in nearly a century appears to be on hold for at least a year. And if you go to these tax cut bill hearings, you hear the same stuff. Well, gosh, guess what? It's inconvenient, but it's just not true. I mean, it's massively not true, and I'll show you that. Some of this goes back to when I was talking about Hancock 2. Let me give you a little bit of history of Hancock and how it's impacted this whole picture. Senate Bill 380 in 1993 implemented a new school formula, and it did very large increases in the individual income tax and the corporate income tax. And so that was implemented without a vote of the people, which is in part what then created the movement for Hancock 2, to put in a second level of restrictions on raising revenue. Because Senate Bill 380 came into place, they collected all the taxes up front but phased in the formula for 4 years. So that did 2 things. It created a massive fund balance in this earmarked fund, and it also, for 4 years, there was no general revenue that went into the school formula. All the increases came from the earmarked funds. And at the same time, the dot-com mania was going up, the economy was good, and the combination of those factors triggered the Hancock refunds. And if you will recall, from fiscal 95 through 99, 5 fiscal years, there were income tax refunds. Well, the other result of that is we started cutting taxes. And what did we do? Okay, I'm going to get there in a second. The importance of this slide is if you go back 20 years and look at GR growth, for the first 10 years from fiscal year 96 through fiscal year 2006, the growth rate is faster than in the next 10 years. And in part, that's because of the Great Recession and also because of the tax cuts. Same story for individual income tax. Believe it or not, these are the changes to individual income tax in the last 20 years. And for those that say, well, we haven't had any tax cuts, let's look at the factors. You know, the simple-minded view of this that was advocated by many for Senate Bill 509 is, well, you have to change the tax rate. Well, if you look at your Missouri tax form, one, it's fed into by your federal tax return, and then it's 2 pages, and at the end of it, you multiply by a tax factor, okay? And that's just one part of the calculation. Well, earlier in that little form, for about 70% of the taxpayers, they take the standard deduction. And do you know what the Missouri statute says about the standard deduction? It's the federal deduction. Well, they index the federal deduction. So since 2001, the indexing of the standard deduction has cost general revenue $400 million. Just that one factor in the calculation. In 1999, we increased the personal exemption. At that time, the cost was $155 million. 1998, independent deduction, $68 million. In 2007, we started implementing a phase-out of the state taxation of Social Security and public pensions. My mom's a retired state employee. She's got Social Security and Mosher's retirement. She doesn't pay any tax on that. That's a recent change. The inheritance tax was phased out due to federal law in the early 2000s. State taxation of military retirement, we got rid of that in 2009. And then we have authorized $650 million of tax cuts, which have not occurred yet. And I will show you in detail in a minute where that comes from. So the idea that we haven't cut any taxes is just ridiculous. Sales tax. Okay, this is our second largest revenue source. In fiscal year 96, 21 years ago, the receipts were $1.6 billion. 21 years later, our receipts are $2 billion. Virtually no growth. Well, what did we do in sales tax? Way back in 1980, we took the sales tax off prescription drugs, also took it off of domestic utilities. The biggest mistake I think we made in tax policy occurred in the late 90s. We took the general revenue portion of the sales tax off of food. So if you go to the grocery store and buy food for home consumption, you do not pay the GR portion of sales tax. That cost $210 million. Manufacturing sales tax. I'm going to tell you very quickly a little story here. When I was in the budget office in about 1989, one of my staff came in and said, you need to look at this Supreme Court decision we just got. And it was the so-called Kentucky Fried Chicken case. And the plaintiff was Kentucky Fried Chicken. And you pay sales tax on manufacturing only to the extent that the product is not delivered in the final product, okay? And so in Kentucky Fried Chicken, they argued that 60% of the oil comes through in the chicken where it is taxed, and so that portion, they should not pay sales tax on the grease, the oil. And they won and they got a refund. Well, about 5 years later, Southwestern Bell said, you know, we looked at that Kentucky Fried Chicken case and we think we're just like Kentucky Fried Chicken, only we're manufacturing voice transmission. And so when we pick up a landline, we're digitizing that signal, we're sending it through servers, and then it's redigitized at the other end, and we think that all those servers should not be subject to sales tax. And guess what? They won. And so we've kind of had this evolving trend of redefining what manufacturing sales tax is, which a bill was passed that in 2005 to 2000, I'm sorry, that in 98, that tried to clarify that. This April, the Missouri Supreme Court took up a case that's MasterCard and IBM. And again, IBM was selling devices to MasterCard that reads digital cards, okay, chip cards. And they were making the same argument. That's manufacturing, shouldn't be taxed. It's going through to the end user. And the Supreme Court went back and said, you know that Southwestern Bell decision from 20 years ago? We think it's wrong. And so they reversed the Southwestern Bell decision. The importance of that is in this kind of environment that I'm telling you about, there probably will be legislation once again in the coming year that will try and define what manufacturing is. And full disclosure, I represent a telecommunications company that's impacted by the decision. We want it clarified, but I think you'll be hearing something about that in the coming year. Another sales tax thing in 2004, vote of the people, half of the motor vehicle sales tax used to go to general revenue, half went to transportation. Vote of the people, all the money went to transportation. And so these are the reasons why you look at the growth in sales tax only from 1.6 billion to 2 billion in 21 years. For those that think, well, you hear Rex Sinkfield say, well, we ought to have the sales tax expanded because it's such a steady source of revenue and it's always growing. You know, it's the old always growing argument. Well, let's look at the actual data. In the last 21 years, we've had growth of more than 6% twice, but not since 2004. We've had growth of 4% or more 3 times. But look, in 16 of the 21 years, we had growth of less than 4%. In 11 of the 21 years, we had growth of less than 2% or negative growth. So when 23% of your general fund is growing at that rate, that is a problem. And oh, by the way, let's hammer home one more time that we're going to start cutting our biggest source, the income tax, 5 times. Corporate receipts. This is shocking. I'm telling you. You're not going to believe this. Okay, and the data, I got this from a legislative staffer, all my chart data, and he only had it back to 2003, fiscal 2003, and which I think is fine for purposes of this. So this data set's not quite as expansive as the other ones. In 2003, corporate receipts were about 230-something million. In 2016, there are 280 million. And look at the drop from 15 to 16, the 35+% drop. Why did this happen? Okay, Senate Bill 19 in 2015, a bill that, again, full disclosure, I worked on behalf of a telecom company, and believe it or not, the reason I was working on it was that we did not want to change our allocation factor. We wanted to do the same thing, and the other telecoms did too. And so what I'm going to show you, you have to realize that the telecom industry, which is huge, didn't get any benefit from this bill. The fiscal note on Senate Bill 19, which I read whenever I was working on this, said the cost was up to $15 million. I now believe that the cost was in excess of $200 million. And because this went into effect in calendar 2015, under the Carnahan Farm Bureau Amendment passed in '96, you cannot reverse that without a vote of the people. Okay, so we made what I believe is a couple $100 million mistake, and it can't be reversed without a vote of the people. And the error effectively, I believe, wiped out a large proportion of the corporate income tax. So let's look at what happened in corporate income tax. Again, in 2015, $436 million. In 2016, $280 million, a 35.6% decline. In the first 2 months of fiscal 2017, July and August, the receipts declined by 41%. So as I indicated, there have been no newspaper articles covering this. And I went to one of my clients who has access to major accounting firms and said, I'm going to send you some data. Will you ask one of these major accounting firms what they think is going on? And this is the response we got from the managing partner of a major accounting firm. And it talks about what is Senate Bill 19, okay? And it says the DOR narrowly interpreted who could make this election based upon a 2013 law. And the Senate Bill 19 became effective August 28th of 2015. More and more taxpayers are taking this election with significant benefits. And these companies now have very small apportionment factors based on the Missouri single sales factor and based apportionment, and thus lower Missouri corporate liabilities. So believe it or not, in 2015, we made what I think is at least a couple $100 million mistake. And think about it, a couple $100 million, you could probably fund the school formula fully and do transportation and all kinds of good things if you had an extra couple $100 million. And I think that's pretty much gone forever without a vote of the people to rectify it. So when you look at changes, we phased out the corporate franchise tax right after the recession of 2009. Great idea. And now we've had Senate Bill 19, and we've effectively just diminished our third largest source of income. Other headwinds, and I think there are going to be withholdings, and again, I was responsible for the state budget for about 4 years. And if you're a policymaker and you get in the middle of a fiscal year like the next governor is going to come into, the question is, if you know you're going to fall off in a cliff in the next fiscal year, why would you spend at a higher level in the current fiscal year only to fall off the cliff? And why would I think we're going to fall off a cliff in 2018? There are $282 million of fund balance in the 18 budget, in the 17 budget that will have to be replaced in the 18 budget. There's $123 million primarily of federal funds that are one time in the 17 budget that will have to be replaced in the 18 budget. And when we grew 0.9% in 16, part of that 0.9%, there was a single taxpayer who on April 30th, 2016, paid $75 million in taxes, which I assume are one time. And so when you get to the comparable reporting period in April of the coming year, you're going to have to account for what's probably a loss of $75 million in one-time money. So I think the future is, boy, it doesn't look good. And again, if you're advising the new governor, you're probably going to tell him you can't wait to cut. And oh, by the way, we're going to be short this fiscal year anyway. So I think significant withholdings are on the horizon. So then we get to Senate Bill 509, which has not even been implemented yet. And so the theory of 509 is that growing revenue receipts, more than $150 million, will trigger the tax cut provisions. The first accounting period started July 1st, 2015, ended June 30th, 2016, and the trigger didn't happen. But within the context of what I'm showing you here, if we grow by 150 million or more, and I think if we grow by that much, we will just exceed it by a little bit, we're then going to cut taxes in calendar year 2018, which will span 2 fiscal years, 2018 and 2019. And so part of the thing will also trigger a reduction in the tax on business income. My business is an LLC, and I'll show you how that plays out here in a minute. And $150 million in growth is only about 1.7% growth. So if we grow more than 1.7%, we're going to cut taxes. I testified to this when 509 was in front of the General Assembly. The advocates point, it's kind of like we haven't had a tax cut in a century, which is not true. Well, the advocates would say revenues always grow. Well, guess what? That's not true either. And we have had 5 negative years of growth since 2001. And in my adult life, there has been a recession at least every 10 years. 1980, roughly 1991, roughly 2001. We know about 2008, 2009. So in my adult life, every 10 years we've had a recession. Guess what 10 years from the last recession is? 2018. And so as we're doing these tax cuts, I think there's a high likelihood that they will occur in a recessionary or very low growth environment. This is the exact fiscal note from Senate Bill 509. The factors in year one, and again, this would be a reduction that's calculated whether you exceed 150 million on a fiscal year basis. Then the tax cuts go in on a calendar year basis. And in year one of the first tax cut, you'd get a reduction in the top tax rate from 6% to 5.9%. My LLC, they would ignore 5% of the business income deduction. They'd ignore 5% of my income. For those with net income less than $20,000, they would get a one-time $500 increase in the personal deduction, and that's shown as $500 each year, but it's a one-time event, okay? It just stays in place. And then they would index the tax brackets. So let's put this discussion, we're going to start cutting tax rates for LLCs. And we've already mistakenly changed the allocation factor for C Corps, okay? So when we looked at Senate Bill 19, that's primarily C Corps. So I have a friend who's a lobbyist, and we've had this discussion before we figured out what was happening with Senate Bill 19. And, I told him, boy, when this gets going, 509, you probably ought to change your tax status to an LLC, because eventually you're going to get to ignore 25% of your income. It's probably worth the expense of doing that. Well, now I think we've created the worst of both worlds, is you can get a tax advantage for some companies, I believe, who are LLCs by changing to C Corps, because you can virtually eliminate any corporate tax liability. Or if you're a C Corp, you might want to change, a C Corp that doesn't do much business outside of Missouri, where most of your receipts are in Missouri, you might want to change to an LLC. So I think you're going to see businesses flip-flopping their tax status. And so there's going to be a dynamic here that potentially the corporate income reductions or the individual income tax reductions both continue to escalate. So what's the cost of Senate Bill 509? So let's assume we, in the next tracking period, at the end of fiscal 17, that we grow by $200 million. In the next calendar year, we're going to cut, and this is based upon 2011 data, we're going to cut what I would say is at least $150 to $160 million out of that $200 million growth. And that's only the first tax cut. If we ever grow more than 150 again, we're going to go down the line here until there are 5 tax cuts, which I believe will exceed $650 million in the aggregate. So to sum up, any good times due to Senate Bill 509 will trigger tax cuts. Proponents of 509 argue that general revenue always grows. I don't believe that. And I think these tax cuts could occur in the midst of a recession. So you could get a scenario where you cut in a recessionary environment, you get a low revenue number, and then you just got to exceed that by $150 million, and you start maybe cutting from a lower number. And so I think if there's any good news here, I think Senate Bill 509, from my perspective, probably takes maybe 10 years or more to get fully implemented. but only because I don't think we're going to have much growth, and growth is what's going to trigger it. And so I think revenue growth is going to be very limited or possibly non-existent in the next 10 or more years. And so, I would go back to what I told you about starting to work on this with the School Boards Association in 1994. What happened in the 90s triggered a series of what I believe are serious tax mistakes, which have continued all the way through Senate Bill 19 in 2015. And we're just in a heck of a mess. We're 70% individual income. That's probably going to go up to 73, 74, 75%. We're going to be cutting our largest revenue source. Sales tax is growing very little, and the future just doesn't look good. So with that, I'm, as Mike said, I told him after I was done, you ought to open the bar. Let me stop and answer any questions, sir. Yes, sir.
You didn't say anything about local sales taxes, which have gone up considerably. What's the state sales tax, 4%?
The state sales tax is 4.225. 3% goes to the general fund. 1% goes to Prop C. An eighth goes to conservation. A tenth goes to parks and soils. And when I talked about cutting the sales tax on food, that was only cut on the 3%. So if you look at the other 1.225 that goes into earmarked state funds, that levy is increasing faster than the 3%. Why is that? You're taxing food, which has more inflation in it.
State legislatures allowed all the municipalities to use sales tax to build all sorts of things.
You're getting on one of my soapbox issues because, yes, that happened again in the 80s, 90s, it started to happen. Yes, where we gave more of the taxing authority that the state used to hold for itself to local governments. And so the answer is, if you go to the mall here, I think you pay slightly less than 8%, and the difference between 4.225 and that roughly close to 8% is local taxes. Yes. Yes. Well, and then on top of that, I can tell you in Jefferson City, if you go to Kohl's or the area around Kohl's, there's a TDD that is, I believe, close to 1% that gets tacked on top of that. So you can have NIDs, SIDs, TDDs on top of the 8%. And yeah, many places, if you go to certain areas of Kansas City, you will pay a 12% sales tax. Yes?
I have a question in regard to businesses coming into the state and they help overall.
I'm having trouble hearing you.
Businesses coming into the state, is there any data on new startups, retention of old businesses? It's not anything
I would tell you there are lies, damn lies, in what you're talking about. Yeah, I'm being facetious. Well, let me give you the business startup issue going back to tax cuts. So I'm an LLC. Let's just assume that whenever that's fully implemented, Senate Bill 509, that I get a $5,000 tax cut, okay? And so the question then is, well, how many jobs do you have to produce to replace the $5,000? Well, the marginal tax rate, effective tax rate for the state is 5%, roughly. The answer is $100,000 in jobs to replace $5,000. And oh, by the way, that $5,000, a third of it's going to go to the federal government in the form of taxes. So all I would tell you is with the corporate tax cuts here, we virtually wiped out the corporate income tax. And I don't think there's going to be any job growth at all. I think companies are going to put that in their pocket because, again, in the aggregate, it's a pretty big number. For an individual company, you give them $1 million or something like that, they're not going to hire more. And particularly for an LLC, if you give them $5,000, which suddenly is subject to federal tax, they're not going to hire anybody. So I think that's one of the myths that's playing itself out in Kansas. And I think we'll see the same thing in Missouri. I apologize for being facetious, but it is. You hear these what I call them urban myths in the legislature all the time, that, oh, we're going to have all this job growth and people, this is an economic development bill, and I just don't believe any of that. Yes?
What's the catalyst for Missouri to be able to come back from this problem?
Well, unfortunately, I think the answer is education. I think what businesses want, we represent an organization that is all the large businesses in Kansas City, and probably the most unimportant factor to them in making decisions about where they're going to locate their business is the tax rate. I've represented them for almost 20 years, and the most important issue for them is quality of life and workforce in making decisions where to locate their businesses. And that goes back to K-12 education and higher education. And I can tell you, when the withholdings come, the first place it's going to get hit is higher education. It always is. And so I think we need to be making more investments in education, but I think we're going to be in a revenue structure where that's not possible. As a matter of fact, the contributions towards education may be declining, I believe. Yes, sir, right now.
Jim, the legislature, when they dismantle the revenue machine and the withholdings come and the payments come, do you think, how do they put that back together if they are so ardently anti-tax that they get us into this hole is where I'm going and the pain is happening? How do we ever get out of it?
Well, you won't want to hear this, but I think the true answer is we don't. So I think we are, people ask me, well, are we going to be like Kansas? Or, there's been this fear that we're going to become Mississippi. I don't think we're going to be quite as bad as Kansas. But having said that, I think we are in a structure where any change to anything that I've shown you here requires a vote of the people. And the voters have not approved any increase in taxes since I worked for Governor Ashcroft in the late 80s, early 90s. And the voters are not prone to increase taxes, and I think we're just going to be where we are. Yes, over here. Yes.
It feels like there'll be a tremendous shift to the local level to pick up and the burden of business increases in local taxes.
I do, and you guys, I'm preaching to the choir here. You know how difficult that is. I live in a city, Jefferson City, which traditionally has increased levies quite a bit. But recently, I don't think that's the sentiment of the voters. And, it's going to be a real challenge for school districts. And one of the problems I think you have is that I would go back to the 35% cut in corporate tax receipts last year. And nobody's talking about it. There's been no news articles, but it's a fact. And the public doesn't know what's going on. And if you look at the campaign ads that are running right now, it's get rid of the insiders in Jefferson City, and, government is bad. And that's not the environment that you want whenever you want to ask your local patrons to increase their levy. Yes, back over here.
With the TIFs that we presently have across the state, what is the possibility of those being curtailed?
Well, that's a complex issue. The question is, what about TIFs? Because in many instances, TIFs, some entity, due to a TIF, may issue bonds, and that's a debt that, if you suddenly default on your bonds because of doing something with the TIF, that's a major credit problem. The state endorsing something like that is a major issue. So I would not anticipate any changes in TIFs. Yes, over here.
In your discussion about the tax reduction for LLCs, it's safe to assume that also encompasses all S corporations as well?
It does, yes. The question is, I focus on LLCs because that's what my business is, but yes, it's S corps and LLCs, and then the Senate Bill 19 ramification is C corps. Yes.
So what's the mindset of the legislators going forward? Do they still don't think they're cutting taxes, so they're actually cut taxes to the
We just cut 60 million in veto session. So you know, and the withholdings that have occurred that have impacted schools thus far are completely related to veto session. None of that is related to what I'm showing you here yet.
So your comment is more withholds besides
Absolutely, because we've got all these unsustainable funds, plus before you get to the unsustainable funds, the one-times, you got to grow 7%. And what I'm showing you here, many of you may see this through one of my clients. This is what I tell my clients. This is what I get paid to do. I'm telling you, I have told my clients for 5 or 6 months, if you got any money in the budget, get it out as soon as you can, because withholdings are coming. And I'm just telling you, that's what, at the public school retirement system, I send them something every month, and that's what I tell them. But by the way, I should have told you to start. For many years, I have been the contract lobbyist for the public school retirement system and peers, and so I also work for you guys in that capacity too. So at the end of Daryl's presentation, you asked about the PowerPoint, and Mike has got that, and we'll post it, I presume, Mike, on MSBA website. And if you've got questions, you could email me at jmoodyjc@gmail.com, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if you've got follow-up questions. Thank you all.
Well, I really appreciate Jim laying it out. It isn't a fun topic, but it's a topic we have to address, and to address with your legislators. Many of them don't understand. They don't see the big picture, and some of these tax cuts they have not looked at far enough in advance. So please keep discussing these with your elected officials. We will keep trying to do what we can. We will still keep working as hard as we can to get the budget going, but be prepared for some very drastic withholds in the next 6 months, and next year we're going to have to fight even harder.